I welcome you all to the module 5. So, module 5 is about memory and forgetting, and today we will talk about lecture number 13, which will focus specifically on the concept of forgetting. So, this is the third lecture and last lecture of this module, and overall it is lecture number 13. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture, which is lecture number 12, which was also part of the same module. So, in the last lecture we discussed about when we recall information from long term memory, how do we recall and what are the processes involved in it. So, we specifically discussed more detailed aspect around recalling information from the long term memory. So, we discussed how do we recall information from long term memory, what are the cues involved in it. So, in that context we discussed retrieval cues. We also discussed the theory of levels of processing theory or levels of processing theory. We discussed that deeper the level of processing we do of any information while learning, that deeper processing ultimately leads to more stronger storage system in the memory, and we are more likely to remember it more later. We also discussed the concept of flashbulb memories. We also discussed the constructive processes in memory, that when we recall an information from long term memory, we do not recall the exact replica that we have stored. Rather than when we recall the information, we many times change a lot of this information depending on the present context and our belief system, our schemas and so on. So, that is the process of that process is called as constructive processes in memory. In that context, we also discuss some specific types which are related to constructive process. One is eyewitness memory and autobiographical memory. So, these are the things we had discussed in the last lecture. So, in today's lecture, we will talk on the concept of forgetting. Why do we forget and what are the things involved in forgetting of information in the long term memory. So, we will talk about different theories of forgetting, forgetting curve, and we will see what are some of the applications of this whole understanding of these modules of memory, particularly in terms of how can we improve our memory. So, let us start today's lecture. So, today we will focus on the concept of forgetting. So, what is forgetting? When we say forgetting, we are basically talking about loss, fading or inability to retrieve information that was previously stored in memory. So, whenever we are not we store a lot of information in the long term memory. As we said, in the long term memory almost infinite number of information can be stored, but we are not able to recall a lot of this information that we store. It may be because of loss of that information or fading, or whatever information is stored, it is not strong enough so that we are able to recall it, or we are not able to retrieve the information. So, there can be many reasons why we forget a lot of information, particularly that are there in the long term memory. So, this process of or loss of information or fading of information or inability to retrieve any information is called as forgetting. So, whatever is stored in memory, but we are not able to retrieve in that particular moment or any particular moment, then we say we forgot that information. But when we talk about forgetting, we are talking that we are talking in terms of that information may still exist in the memory. It is still exists in some form in the memory, but we are not able to retrieve that information. So, forgetting does not mean complete loss of information all the time, but it may be there in memory, but we are not able to retrieve it. So, that is also part of forgetting. So, it may still exist in memory, but we fail to access it whenever needed. So, as we discussed that concept of tip of the tongue phenomena in the last class, that is also one of the examples that many times we know that information is there, I know, but I am not able to recall exactly. So, that is called tip of the tongue phenomena. There also shows that many times we are not able to retrieve those information. Now, one of the important concept that is discussed when we talk about forgetting is called forgetting curve. So, this is basically shows the pattern of forgetting whenever we learn an information. What is the loss of information? How do we forget? What is the percentage of forgetting when we learn something? So, that whole pattern is shown in the forgetting curve. So, this curve of forgetting is one of the most important concepts in the psychology of memory particularly, and it was described by Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885. So, he was a German psychologist who conducted systematic studies on memory, and he himself tested this lot of these things on himself, So we'll talk about that. As a result, he discovered something called as a forgetting curve. So forgetting curve shows how information is lost over time whenever there is no attempt to retain it. Let's say you just learned something, but you are not very consciously trying to retain that information. How do you forget that information? What is the pattern of forgetting? So that is what is shown in the forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus found that the memory retention drops sharply soon after the learning and then levels off gradually. So he found soon after the learning, lot of this information actually we forget, lot of it, particularly in the beginning once we learn something, and especially when we are not able to retain, when we are not consciously trying to retain that information. And then slowly that rate of forgetting decreases. It becomes kind of levels off. Initially there is a sharp decline or forgetting, then there is a leveling off. Then the forgetting happens more slowly. So right after learning something, we remember most of it, but within hours or days, a large portion is forgotten. After that, forgetting slows down. Whatever remains tends to be remembered for a long time. So initially the forgetting is highest, and then it kind of becomes, the forgetting becomes, we tend to remember rest of the things for a long time. So that is what is called as a forgetting curve. So Hermann Ebbinghaus, he discovered this whole forgetting curve in 1885 while conducting a series of experiments on himself. So he himself was the subject of that experiment, where he memorized a list of nonsense syllables. So we'll talk about what is nonsense syllables, and then tested himself on various time intervals to measure how much he forgotten. So he learned a list of nonsense syllables. Nonsense syllables means these syllables don't make any sense. They are not proper words. They are combination of 3 letters. And then he tried to look at how much he retained those information in a different time intervals. So from that data, he created something called as a forgetting curve. So nonsense syllables, which was the test material for this experiment, these are basically meaningless 3-letter combination. There is no meaning to this combination of letters. So this pattern is consonant, vowel, consonant, CBC pattern. So it doesn't make any sense. So they do not form real words. For example, BOK, ZAF, DAX. These words are combination of consonant, vowel, consonant, and they don't make any sense or proper word. So you are not able to connect them with generally any previous learning and so on. So therefore, they are very neutral material to understand exactly in a pure form how memory works. But for example, if proper words are given, then you may connect this word with some already existing knowledge system, and you may remember it for a long time because you know that word, or you know the meaning of that word more deeply. So then there will be biases in terms of, we will not be able to exactly measure the pure form of memory. So therefore, he used something called as a nonsense syllables, and they don't have any meaning. That is why they are called nonsense. And so you are not able to kind of connect them with any meaningful words and so on. So if you remember this kind of letters, that means it shows the pure memory. So there will not be any biases here. So that's why he used nonsense syllables. So why did he use nonsense syllables? Primarily, because to measure memory in its pure form, without the influence of meaningful experience. So if there is a proper meaningful word, obviously you will connect with it and you will be able to remember it. Some words may have a very distinctive meaning to you and you will remember them automatically. So there will be biases in it. So real words like dog, school already have meaning, and it is much more easier to remember them because you already know them. So therefore, nonsense syllables are used to remove those biases. Nonsense syllables generally have no prior associations or prior connections because they don't have any meaning system. So therefore, Hermann Ebbinghaus, he used these nonsense syllables to measure pure memory, how much is retained and how much is lost and so on. What he found, that there is a rapid decline in memory retention during the first hour of learning. When he learned this kind of list of nonsense syllables, he found that in the first 1 hour or so, there is a rapid decline of memory. He forgot a lot of this list of nonsense syllables. with over half of the information is forgotten within the first 20 minutes. The rate of forgetting after that slowed down, but there was still a significant decline over time. So, this curve illustrates that memory retention drops sharply within the first few hours after learning, often dramatically in the first few initially after learning. So, this decline is not linear. Instead, it follows an exponential pattern with rapid initial forgetting that eventually slows down over subsequent days. So, initially there is an exponential forgetting, rate of forgetting is exponential, then it levels off and so on. So, there is no linear relationship in terms of with the passage of time, when you forget things, it is not a linear relationship, So, initially it is exponential and then it levels off and so on. So, this is what is called as a forgetting curve. So, in terms of curve, this is this looks like this, that when you learn something, let's say initially you learned something 100%, then there is a rapid decline in a first, let's say 20 minutes. This is what Ebbinghaus found from his experimenting this on himself, that first 20 minutes or 1 hour or so, that there is a rapid decline, and then there is a slow decline. Whatever is remained after that, then decline is much steady and slow. Okay? So, within 1 hour of learning, what Ebbinghaus found, about about 40% of it is like retained, little above them 40% is retained, rest is forgotten and so on. So, this is what the curve looks like. Percentage was shown in the same curve. Here is its Ebbinghaus learning curve. So, these are percentages of how much is retained, retained. After 20 minutes, about here it is shown little above 50%. Within 1 hour it is about 44%, 9 hours. So, this percentage can vary a little bit based on the different participants, but the general percentage remains almost same. So, after 31 days, he found about 21% is retained of whatever was learned. So, initially there is a sharp decline, then it levels off. So, that is this pattern of forgetting is what is called as Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So, when we measure memory in the pure form, when we learn probably the materials which are meaningful and so on, the pattern may be little different, but in the pure form, this is how the forgetting happens. This is the rate of forgetting, that is what is found by Ebbinghaus. So, in a general rule, the forgetting curve tells us that about 1 day you forget, within 1 day you forget about 70% of the information you have read or heard. Remaining 30% are forgotten at a slower rate. So, this 70% is forgotten very fast, then remaining 30%, the rate of forgetting is much slower. Some studies shows that about 31 days you will remember about 4% of what you have learned, and others show that number to be about 20%. So, this percentage can vary a little bit here and there, but the pattern of graph seems to remain same. So, Ebbinghaus also developed a saving method to measure memory retention. So, he also used something called as a saving method. What is saving method here? Saving method is a technique used to measure how much information is retained in memory by comparing initial learning time with relearning time. So, when you learn something for the first time, so it takes probably more time. Then let us say when you again learn the same thing later, you will require less time because there is a familiarity of the content. So, there is a saving of time when you relearn again. So, that is called the saving method. So, he first recorded how many repetitions were needed to memorize a list of nonsense syllable, and then counted how many repetitions were required to relearn the same list after a delay. So, he was using this saving method, that when he was trying to find how many repetitions are required to learn initially, and then when the same list is learned again after some time, some interval of time or some delay, how many repetition is required in relearning and so on. The difference indicated the amount of memory retained for instance, if 10 repetitions were needed initially and 5 repetitions when you relearn the same material, then the saving was 50%, because you took half of the time, half of the trial. Initially you took 10 trial to retain a particular list of words, but when you relearned it, you took only 5 trial. So, that means the saving was 50%. So, that is called the saving method. You require less time, less number of repetitions to learn something when you relearn something. So, that is the method of saving. So, what is the applied implication of this? One of the important applied implication of this that so we need to use something called as a spaced practice when you learn something, so that will enhance our memory. So, research shows that people retain more information when they space their study lesson rather than cramming in a single sitting. So, when you learn something, everything at a time, so that means what, you are more likely to forget a lot of it, immediately after learning, because you are crammed everything. If you space the learning material with certain interval of time, then you are more likely to retain the information. This is what is called as a massed versus spaced practice effect. This occurs because cramming leads to mental fatigue that interferes with learning and retention. So, when you learn everything at a time without giving space, there is a mental fatigue, and also you are likely to forget, because you have learned everything at a time, you are going to forget a lot of this information initially. So, when you space this, that forgetting is going to be less, and also the mental fatigue is going to be less. So, this practical implication is very clear. Spacing study session enhances long-term learning. Interestingly, similar benefits of spaced practice have also been observed in animal learning also. When you teach something to animal also, the spaced practice with giving some interval of time seems to help more in terms of retaining information for humans also and also animals also. So, that is one of the important practical implication of this understanding. So, let us now look into more detailed theoretical explanation of why we forget. So, we have seen through forgetting curve what is the pattern of forgetting when we measure memory in the pure form, like using nonsense syllables and so on. But the question is, why do we forget? What is the explanation behind forgetting when we learn something? When we memorize something, why do we forget? What is the explanation? So, let us look into some of the theoretical explanations. One of the most important reasons why we forget in many cases is something called as a failure of encoding. We simply never pay enough attention for the information to be stored in long-term memory. So, many times we simply forget because we do not pay attention to the information. So, we are not able to be encoded in the long-term memory properly. So, this information has not even stored properly. So, how are you going to remember it? So, that is called as a failure of encoding. We simply do not pay enough attention to be stored it properly with proper strength, so that you are able to remember it. So, that is one of the reasons for a lot of forgetting, not the only reason. So, without proper encoding, memories cannot form, making recall almost impossible. For example, all the people in our country are exposed to, let us say, 500 rupees notes hundreds of time in their daily interactions, or in a certain people have come across, let us say, 500 rupees note. Many times we all might have seen that note, but if we ask people, can they explain what is in the front side, what is in the back side? Most of us will not be able to say what is there in that note, simply because we do not pay attention to it. So, that is the failure of encoding. So, how are you going to remember something? Simply because you have not even encoded the information properly. So, if I just ask what is in the back side of a 500 notes, most of the people will not be able to say anything, simply because we do not pay attention to it. Okay? So, that is the example of a failure of encoding. So, simply you have not stored it. For example, here I have just shown the figure, front side and back side. We see it every day, but probably we will only remember the face of Mahatma Gandhi, not much more than that. Back side, probably we do not even pay attention what is there in so on. So, these are the examples of failure of encoding, even though we are exposed to this thing on a daily basis, but we still are not able to remember it because we have not paid attention to it. So, even when information is now, so that is one reason that we many times we do not encode the information properly, so we forget. There are other reasons also. So, many times we encode the information successfully into the memory, we pay attention and it is encoded in the long term memory. Despite encoding properly, we are not able to remember a lot of information. Okay? We are not able to, or we find it difficult to recall it later. So, there can be so many other reasons for such failure of retrieving information. So, one is many times we forget because we do not encode the information. Even if we encode the information in many cases, we are still not able to remember this information. There can be many reasons behind it. So, some of the theories explains even despite encoding the information, why do we forget? One is called as a decay theory. So, we will talk about each of them. So, decay theory, then there are interference factors, then there are cue dependence forgetting and so on. So, let us explain these factors in more detail. These are all different theories to explain why we forget. The first is decay theory, or this is also called as a trace theory of forgetting. This theory says this is an idea that memory are physical traces in the brain that fades over time and can be traced back to even Plato's writing about 2500 years ago. So, it is a very simple concept. When we store an information in the brain, so there is a trace. So, there is some changes, some neurochemical changes happens in the brain, and it is a trace that memory gets stored in your brain. With the passage of time, that trace slowly gets erased. So, you forget it. So, this is very simple concept that we forget because whatever we learn, it simply decays with the passage of time. This concept is known as decay theory or trace theory of forgetting, which says that memory traces naturally deteriorate with the passage of time. The concept is theory. So, that whatever traces are formed as a memory, they slowly again deteriorate or decay with the passage of time. So, that is one of the way we forget things. So, this theory gained strong support from early experienced research of Ebbinghaus, which we talked about, forgetting curve, who studied how memory weakens over time. Let us say with the passage of time, he found that generally we forget more and more. Initially it is more, as we discussed, but then it levels off, but still there is a forgetting happens with the passage of time. So, that is a kind of evidence for this decay theory. So, we learned something, and then there is a memory trace, which is also called as engram, is formed in the brain. If that memory is not revisited, practiced or retrieved, if you do not use it again and again, so that trace will gradually weaken and eventually disappear, and you will not be able to remember it. So, that is the idea of decay theory. However, this theory cannot explain many aspects of the forgetting, simply because this theory has certain limitations. So, although the decay contributes to forgetting, it does not fully explain how memory loss occurs in many cases. For example, research shows that there is often no consistent relationship between passage of time and how well information is recalled. In real life context, there is no consistent relationship between passage of time and forgetting. Many times we remember a lot of information which are stored much more earlier. So, we learned something quite long time back, but still we can remember, but many times we are not able to remember very recent information. Very recently learned information we forget, but we are able to recall informations which are learned long back. So, there is no consistent relationship. How do we explain? The decay theory cannot explain these factors. So, one would expect that the longer the time since learning, the poorer the recall, but that does not happen in many cases. Another key limitations of this theory is that it cannot explain the uneven rate of forgetting. So, that is the same concept, uneven rate. Not every time the rate of forgetting is same. Some memories remain vivid while others fade quickly. Some memories we are able to remember very vividly and clearly, and some we forget very soon. So, there is an uneven rate of forgetting. If there is a decay of memory traces, then it has to be even with the passage of time there has to be more forgetting, and it should be followed in most all the cases, but that is not happening. So, there is an uneven forgetting rate. Some information we forget, some information we do not forget. So, decay and trace theory cannot kind of explain very satisfactory to lot of these cases. For example, distinctive and unusual information is remembered better than ordinary details. So, it also depends on what kind of information, not just passage of time. So, some distinctive unusual information we remember them, we do not forget them, but a lot of other information we forget. So, these are some of the limitations of decay theory. Even if you see the forgetting curve, it is not very linear, we have seen. So, there is a rapid forgetting initially, then there is a level of. So, passage of time, there is no linear relationship between the passage of time and forgetting, even in the forgetting curve that we discussed. So, after that the memory tends to be more gradual, loss of memory, and so that is also another reason, limitation of decay theory. Now, another factor that also influence memory loss is interference, where new and old information disrupt retrieval of new information. So, many times whenever we learn new information, old information gets interfered with the new information, and we are not sometimes get confused, and we are not able to remember a lot of information, and the opposite or vice versa also can happen. So, that is called interference. Many times we are not able to retrieve an information because of interference of many information, similar information, and we get simply confused which one is what. We are not forget many times because of interference also. So, the next theory, so these are the limitations of decay theory. Some of this limitation is addressed in the next theory, which is called as an interference theory. Now, this theory says that forgetting often occurs not just because of decay, but because of similar memories compete with one another. When there are similar information we store, we get like there is a competition and there is mixed of information, and we get confused and we are not able to retrieve information. So, sometimes it becomes more difficult to recall an information simply because of interference of information. For example, you may forget what you ate for dinner a week ago, Wednesday, due to interference from other dinners before and after that day. So, many times we are not able to remember before 1 week on a particular day what was the menu of my dinner, simply because we had similar dinners in many before that day and after that day, and all get interfered, and we are not able to exactly remember. So, that is an example of how interference leads to forgetting. In contrast, a distinctive event such as your wedding day is unlikely to be forgotten because it stands out and there is no interference. Whenever something is very distinctive, an event sometimes happens in your life, we do not forget that event simply because there is no interference, because this particular event stands out uniquely and no such similar event happened. So, we remember that. So, there is no interference. If you look at what we ate in dinner, because dinner we every day take dinner, so there is a lot of interference, there is nothing unique about it. Okay? Maybe some dinner, if it was very unique dinner, probably we will remember it, but if no, it is a very normal routine kind of dinner, we will forget it, simply because every day we had a routine kind of dinner, similar information. But when something is very distinctive, like someone's wedding day or someone's particular birthday, whatever it is, it stands out, and so there is no similar information around it, so we tend to remember it more. So, there is less interference. So, does interference theory explain ordinary events fade quickly, whereas unique experiences remains vivid over time simply because of lack of interference. The greater the similarity between events, the greater likelihood of interference. So, therefore, if more similar events are there, then they are more likely to be interfere with each other and we are likely to forget them. But if something is unique, stands out, then we are likely to remember it more simply because there is less interference. So, that is one of the proposition of interference theory, which explains some of the cases which are not explained by the decay theory. Now, when we talk about interference, there can be two types of interference. One is called as retroactive interference, another is called as a proactive interference. What are these? Let us see now. So, when we say retroactive interference, it occurs when New learning disrupts the recall of previously learned information. So, when you learn something new, if there was some similar thing that you learned previously or in the past, then it disrupts the recall of those past information. So, new learning disrupt. Whenever similar thing you learn, you are less likely to remember the similar thing that you learned in the past. So, past memories, it becomes difficult to remember them when similar things are learned again. So, new learning. So, new learning kind of interference with the old learning, and as a result we are not able to recall old learning in a proper way. So, for example, material learned in later class may interfere with what you learned earlier in that morning. So, let us say similar subject, you learned something in the first class, or then you learned something in the later classes. So then whatever the material you learned in the later classes, later, like more recently, it will interfere with what you learned in the, let us say, in the first class or in the morning, because the contents were similar. So, this new memories overwrite or weaken the unstable earlier ones that are being still inconsolidated or that are still being consolidated. Because these memories are not still consolidated properly, if something similar new is learned, it will interfere. So, new learning interferes with the recall of the old learning is called as a retroactive interference. Proactive is just opposite to that. When older memories interfere with new learning, so just in an opposite direction. For example, remembering a new area code may be difficult because the old one keeps coming to your mind. Sometimes you will find it difficult to learn a new area code or a new mobile number because it is old ones keeps coming back and interfere with it. So, that's an example of proactive interference. Difficult to recall new information because of the interference from the past. So, that is proactive, and in case of retroactive, when you learn something new, old, it is difficult to remember the old information. So, that is called retroactive interference. So, this thing kind of illustrate how interference rather than just passage of time leads to forgetting. So, just passage of time may lead to forgetting, but not necessarily in every cases. Interference is also another factor. So, that is called interference theory. It can also explain this something called as a serial position effect. What is serial position effect? This interference theory can explain something called as a serial position effect, which means the tendency to remember first and last items in a list better than those in the middle. So, whenever you learn a list of items, so let us say 10 items. So, there will be some item in the beginning, some item in the last, some item in the middle. The research shows that people generally tend to remember more from the beginning of the list and end of the list, and they are they find it difficult to remember items in the middle of the list. So, that is called as a serial position effect, and interference theory can explain why this happens. How do you explain that? So, when you start learning a list of items, so initial items, you remember them more because of something called as a primacy effect. Means you give importance to it, you just learning something fresh, and obviously you give more importance and you are able to remember them more. End item we remember more because of recency effect, because you just learned it, the last items. So, that is called recency effect. While the middle items are easily forgotten due to interference from both in the beginning item and the end item. So, because they are in the middle, so there is a more interference. What you learn in the beginning, what you learn in the end, they will interfere with whatever you learned in the middle of the items. So, people find it difficult to recall items from the middle of a list. So, that is called serial position effect, and it can be explained by the interference theory, because we are less likely to remember information from a middle of a list simply because there is higher interference from the beginning item and the end item. For example, one such research was conducted in the real life context. Researcher asked college students to recall as many US presidents possible, whatever the names comes to their mind. The result clearly showed that students remembered the first few presidents in the beginning and more recent ones far better than those in the middle time interval. So that clearly shows the serial position effect. However, even in the middle also some names who are very exceptionally uniquely contributed, like Abraham Lincoln and so on, Andrew Johnson's were recalled little better because of their unique contributions and so on. But from the average data, most of the students remember more from the beginning and more from the recent list of presidents than from the middle. So that's a clear case of serial position effect. So serial position effect in the graph we can show it like this. So that's serial position. So let's say you learn an item 1 to 9. So initially we remember more in terms of probability of recall. Because of the primacy, you give more importance to the initial list. Then slowly you tend to recall less, and again you are more likely to recall the last items. And here interference is highest. So there is more interference. So that's the explanation given for this. Some research also indicates that the individuals with normal memory ability typically recalls about 70% of the first 3 items, which are because of the primacy. So 70% they recall first few items and about 60% of the last few items, like last 3 items. However, the recall drops around 40% of the middle words. Let's say 3, 3, 3, 9 words. First 3 words were recalled 70% of the first 3 items were recalled. Last were 60%, last 3 words were recalled, and middles were about 40% recalled. So this is what the graph shows. So the main reason, as I discussed, interference is minimum in the first and last items, but the interference is highest in the middle item. So that is what it explains. Now, what is the applied implication of this finding, that all about the interference, concept of interference? How do we apply this understanding in our real world? So although interference in memory is unavoidable, whatever we learn, a lot of things will interfere. Several strategies can help reduce its effect. Several strategies can be used to reduce the effect of interference. For example, research shows that taking rest or sleep reduces the interference. So getting adequate sleep after learning enhances memory consolidation. Research shows that sleep helps convert fragile new memories into stable long-term memories. So if you take enough rest, space, and let's say enough sleep after learning something, then the proper consolidation happens and the interference effect reduces. Second factor is rehearse fresh memories. The new long-term memories are initially fragile. That's why interference works very strongly, because the memories are very fragile, just you learned something. So rehearsing and practicing them more and more, either aloud or silently, can make them more stable and resistant to interference. Engage in overlearning, like continuing to review and practice with passage of time again and again. The more you practice, more you rehearse them, then they become more consolidated and less likely to be influenced by other similar information or interference from them. So taking rest, sleep, rehearsing, these factors actually reduces interference. So similar, connected to that also is giving yourself a break. That also helps to consolidate memories. Avoid scheduling classes or study sessions back to back. Short breaks between learning sessions allows recent memories to be consolidated. Many times avoiding sequential study of similar material is also advised, because when you learn similar things one after the other, then there is more interference. try, for example, not to study similar subject consecutively, as this increases the likelihood of more interference. For example, studying French immediately after Spanish may cause confusion between two languages, because maybe very similarity is very high. So, very similar material should not be studied consecutively, that increases the chances of interference. The last theory that talks about why we forget is something called as a cue dependent forgetting. So, this is another explanation of certain cases of forgetting. So, cue dependent forgetting refers to the inability to retrieve information from long term memory due to absence of cues or triggers that present during encoding. So, many times we are not able to remember something simply because there is cues are not present. You are not able to remember because the right kind of stimulus is not present. If that is present, it will make you remember a lot of things, but if it is absent, you are not able to remember a lot of things. So, this absence of cues makes you forget. You are not able to retrieve that information simply because that cue is not present. So, memory retrieval often relies on cues, specific stimuli that prompts association of event, information, context when the memory was first encoded. When we learned something, lot of cues are present, If those cues are present later also, we are able to remember those information again because that were present during learning. So, we will see how that happens. So, forgetting occurs according to this is because not because memory is erased, not because mainly because necessary cues are missing. So, that is retrieval failure happens because of that. When we encode information, we not only encode that information, we also encode the context of that information. What is the environment, what is there in the surrounding, what kind of emotions you had, what kind of, all these things are also get encoded with the memory. So, if any of this is present, you are more likely to remember that information because that was there when you learned something. That is called as an encoding specificity principle as proposed by Tulving. So, that is called encoding specificity principles. What does that mean? Is that it was proposed by Tulving, stated that memory retrieval is more effective when the context, environment or internal state at the time of retrieval matches the condition present during the initial coding of information. What does that mean? Is that what is encoding specificity principle? It says memory retrieval is more effective or more easy when the context, whatever the context in which you learn, environmental setup and internal state within your system, psychological state, physiological state, it matches or it is present when you retrieve it. So, whatever context was present during learning, if that is present when you retrieve it, you are more likely to retrieve it because the context serves as a cue. So, then you are more likely to remember whatever you have learned because those cues are present when you are trying to retrieve those information. So, let us see some more specific examples. So, what are the examples of such context specificity? One is called context dependent memory. What does that mean? So, here matching the physical environment. So, if your physical environment in which you learned something, if that physical environment is present when you recall, you are more likely to remember that information because physical environment serves as a cue or context that triggers memory. For example, some research shows that divers who learned words underwater remember them better underwater than on the land. So, let us say this was actual experiment done when divers, when they went inside the water and they learned some, let us say, list of words, they are more likely to remember those words when they are in the underwater because they learned it underwater as compared to when they come on the land, because those underwater physical environment serve as a cue that helps them to remind those words. So this can extend to so many different examples. So if you learn a lot of concepts in a particular classroom, if you, let us say, give examination in the same classroom, you are more likely to remember them because this classroom serves as a cue. So that is called context dependent memory. Then comes state dependent memory. So it is about matching the internal physiological state. So, when you learn something, what was the physiological state inside your body? If that is also present while recalling, then recalling is much better. You are more likely to remember that. For example, if you study while caffeinated, let us say after taking coffee, you may perform better if you have caffeinated during the test. Let us say when you want to remember it, if you take let us say a cup of coffee, you are more likely to remember, because that same coffee creates same internal state and it serves as a cue, stimulates those memories, because it was present during learning. Now again it is present, so you are more likely to remember it. So that is an example of state dependent memory. Then comes something called as a mood congruent memory. What does that mean? It is about matching the emotional state. So whenever you learn something in a particular emotional state, when you recall that information, if you are in the same emotional state, you are more likely to remember it. If that is absent, you are more likely to forget it or find it difficult to remember it. For example, when you are sad, it is much more easier to recall other sad memories than happy ones. It is very common examples. When we become sad, we are more likely to remember a lot of sad information from our life, and when we are happy, we are more likely to remember more happier information. So that is called mood congruent memory. Same mood triggers similar earlier things that we learn in the under same mood. So one mood will stimulate similar mood related information. The last one is about semantic or cognitive cues. So that is about category or theme associated with the information as a cue. So any kind of meaning or any kind of cognitive thought related stimulus serve as a memory. For example, recalling apple when you prompted with the cue fruit. So let's say fruit serve as a cue. Then you remember, okay, it must be apple. Let's say you are not able to remember something, but somebody says it is a fruit. You immediately then remember it must be apple and something like that. So fruit serve as a cue, semantic cue and so on. So these are all examples of cue dependent memory, and this shows cues which were present while you learning. If they are present while recalling, then the recalling is more likely to be better. If they are absent, you are more likely to forget them. So these are about some specific explanations of why we forget. Now many times forgetting happens not just because of some psychological reasons, but because of some other biological factors. So those are generally called as a memory dysfunction. Sometimes because of certain dysfunctions, not because of normal forgetting, people forget lot of things. One such concept is called as an amnesia and another is called as a dementia. What are these? Now let us look into this. Amnesia refers to a significant loss of memory over a specific time span, distinct from normal forgetting. So in normal forgetting, you tend to forget a lot of information, with the passage of time or interference, whatever it is, whatever we have discussed. So that is a normal forgetting, it happens for everyone. In case of amnesia, you lose, specific memory abilities in a specific time span, Some specific type of memory ability, you simply lose that ability either because of some accidents or some kind of changes in the brain and so on. So you lose some specific aspects of the memory. So that is called amnesia. You forget some aspect of information, It involves the complete loss or erasure of previously stored information. In amnesia, mostly we completely forget about something. And a lot of forgetting, we don't completely forget, but we are not able to recall at that moment. But in case of amnesia, generally there is a complete loss of previous stored information, often after events like head injury or traumatic event and so on. So there are two main types of amnesia. One is called organic amnesia, another is called functional amnesia. So you completely forget some information. So organic amnesia is caused by some physical damage in the brain because of accidents or something like that, or some brain stroke or so on, injury, surgery and so on, where certain areas of the brain cell dies due to loss of blood, oxygen or nutrients, and because that brain area is not able to function, your memory functioning get also disrupted. So it's an organic disruption. Functional amnesia, on the other hand, is a result from psychological trauma or extreme stress without any specific detectable brain damage However, there may be some subtle damages, but there is no specific brain damage happens, but it is because of extreme impact of psychological trauma or extreme stress. Sometimes some people forget a lot of things. So that's called functional amnesia. Generally, so it is called functional because brain areas remains functional. Like since brain function supports all memory, subtle neural changes may be involved in it. Functional amnesia is more difficult to study because it can sometimes leads to intentionally faking memory or loss. So it is very difficult to actually find is it an actual loss, or it's a kind of temporary loss, or it is somebody is faking those memory loss or not. So that's a kind of some controversy involved in it. But organic amnesia is a very real amnesia where certain brain damages lead to loss of memory. Organic amnesia can impair sometimes episodic memory. So you forget certain episodes of your life, but other informations remain intact, like you are able to remember facts and knowledges, whatever it is. You may remember what is 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. Those informations remain intact, but you may forget some events of your life. So there can be impairment of episodic memory, but semantic memory may remain. Semantic memory means general knowledge and facts may remain intact. Most of the cases are like this, but opposite can also happen where your semantic memory may get disrupted and episodic memories may remain intact. Episodic memory is some events in the past that happened in your life. So it can happen in either way. So like these are like examples given, like individuals may forget what they were doing just before the accident, but still remember their name and birth date. So they may forget what happened, the events, but they remember their birth date, gender information. So that's an example of episodic memory is getting lost, but semantic memory remain intact. And the opposite can also happen where semantic memory is impaired, but episodic memories get disrupted. So so a lot of such evidences are also there. So different patterns of amnesia arise from different types of brain damage. So what kind of forgetting happens depends on what the brain damage is, in which part of the brain, depends on which part of the brain damage happens. For example, damage to hippocampus or neural connection associated with it often leads to severe amnesia, where people may forget a lot of things because hippocampus is important for memory consolidation and so on. Damage to cortical areas can also, severe long-term memory loss can also leads to severe long-term memory, or can also produce selective memory depending on where and the specific dynamics involved in it. So amnesia can affect memory in two ways. One is retrograde amnesia, one is called anterograde amnesia. These are very similar to how we discuss interference, retrograde interference, and proactive interference and retroactive interference. So similarly, amnesia can be also of two types: retrograde amnesia or anterograde amnesia. What does that mean? Retrograde amnesia involves disruption or loss of past memories. So in retrograde amnesia, you simply forget a lot of past information. For example, people may simply forget about infantile or childhood amnesia, where most people cannot recall early life events. So that's retrograde. Something that happened past, you simply forget about it, or loss of that information. Anterograde amnesia impairs ability to store new information while older informations are intact. You are able to remember a lot of whatever happened in the past. All this information remain intact, memories, but new information you are not able to remember after a certain, let's say, brain injury or something like that. So the classic case that we discussed in some of the classes is patient HM, who had this typical case of anterograde amnesia. So he was able to remember a lot of his past information, but he could not form new long-term memories. So amnesia can be of retrograde amnesia or anterograde amnesia. Now comes the dementia. Now dementia is little different from amnesia. So dementia is more of a progressive decline. Anterograde in amnesia, it was like sudden, because of some incident or something that you suddenly there is a memory loss. In dementia, there is a progressive decline of cognitive functions. Slowly your cognitive functions deteriorates, including memory functions. So that's called dementia, which can affect slowly to your daily functioning, because you are not able to remember a lot of this information. So dementia is a broad progressive decline in overall cognitive function, whereas amnesia is specific loss of memory. Amnesia is specific memory function get lost because of certain particular incidents. It's generally not progressive, but dementia is very progressively, there is some kind of broader decline of cognitive function, including memory. Along with that, thinking, thought, decision making, other things can also decline. One of the clear example of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, which progressively disrupt neural connections. Alzheimer's amnesia starts, initially start with the mild deficits, then it worsen over time. So there is a progressive decline. This type of memory, most effect varies. Some patients lose more spatial memory, while other experience greater verbal memory loss and so on. So there is a progressively, there is a typical case of Alzheimer's disease is a typical case of dementia. So there is a progressively loss of cognitive functions, including memory is one aspect, and many other functions also declines. So that is how it is different from amnesia. Now people also talk about, which is a little controversial concept in memory, which is called repressed memory. That sometimes people forget simply not because of some brain damage or accident, but simply because those memories goes deeper into unconscious mind, which is a psychoanalytic concept. So that's called motivated forgetting or repressed memories. Although the evidence for this is still controversial, but this concept also exists. So numerous dramatic cases have emerged in individuals suddenly recalling some emotionally intense events. Sometimes suddenly people start recalling something that happened in their life, or for the rest of the life they did not remember, or they forgot about those events, but suddenly they start remembering something happened in their childhood and so on. So a lot of these cases, psychoanalytic people, from the Freudian perspective, they try to explain this as a motivated forgetting, that people forgot those because these are too intense and emotionally disturbing memories, so they suppressed or repressed those information in the deeper in the unconscious part of the mind, and then later suddenly they may appear. So such as childhood sexual abuse, raising debate over whether these are repressed memories or real experiences or false memories created later. So a lot of these are actually debatable in that context, but a lot of such cases emerged that suddenly people remember a lot of their childhood incidents, particularly the traumatic memories like sexual abuse and so on. They start reporting that happened, and earlier they were not remembering them and so on. So this mostly Freudian people or psychoanalytic people, they say repressed memories are genuine experiences that were pushed into unconscious because they were too threatening to face. This information is so traumatic that you are not able to face, especially during childhood. So this information suddenly automatically pushed back into the unconscious mind, and you could not remember them. But later suddenly they may come in the surface and you remember them. So they are also called as recovered memory. Some people claim to have recalled traumatic events of early childhood, sometimes before the age of 3, such as sexual abuse. Few reports are also, many people claim some implausible claims also, including persons claim to being tied to a dolphin during a satanic ritual and so on. Like people claimed so many unusual, bizarre things also, which are sometimes difficult to believe and so on. That something happened in their childhood, difficult to verify also and so on. Researchers have documented many instances of such recovered memory turn out to be false also. Suddenly they say this has happened, and then when verified they found nothing such events happened. Many people recollected, particularly in the West there was a culture of alien abduction and so on. People started remembering those things, but then they were found a lot of these informations are actually false and so on. So the questions of whether repressed memories truly exist still remains one of the most contentious debates in modern memory research. People in the psychoanalytical traditions or Freudian perspective, they believe it is a real thing, and a lot of other psychologists still debate about it. But this is a phenomena that also is discussed in the field of memory. Now at the end, let us see what are the applications of all this understanding of memory. How can we improve memory? Some of the things that comes out from this understanding. Now one of the things when we talk about improving memory in terms of application of this knowledge, There is something called as an SQ3R technique. It uses a lot of this understanding from memory principles to enhance memory functions. So, what is SQ3R technique? Is a scientifically designed study method to help improve comprehension, retention and recall of information. So, what is SQ3R? It is an acronym, means each letter means a particular word. So, S means survey, Q means question, 3R, one R is read, another R is recite and the last one is review. So, when you want to learn something, so this is a kind of very comprehensive technique to learn and process it deeply so that you can remember it more. So, this is called SQ3R, means survey, question, read, recite and review. So, let us just briefly look into it. One is called survey. Survey means when you learn something initially, any material, do the survey first. Quickly scan the material before reading in detail. So, before you go into deeper aspects of learning, just quickly scan it. What are the broad aspects that you are going to learn? Survey it. Look at titles, headlines, headings, subheadings, summaries, graph, bold words, broader. What is the content here? Survey it. What are the broader things that are discussed here? This gives an overview of the structured and main ideas, helping the brain to prepare mental framework. So, you create a mental framework. What expectations? What are you going to learn in this particular concept or particular study material? So, that is called survey. Then question. Then turn headings into questions. For example, if there is a chapter on memory, you can ask what is memory, how does forgetting occurs. So, you are processing it more deeply. So, certain questions helps you to process information. It helps you to give more attention to find answer. When you create questions, your mind tries to find answers, so your attention becomes much more focused. So, when you turn headings and broader concepts into questions, you are more likely to find answers and your attention automatically gets diverted to it, you give more attention to the content to find answers. So, create questions. Ask questions before reading increases curiosity and focuses attention on finding answer, which strengthens your understanding. Because once you create question, you will always try to find answer. What is the answer of this question? What is the answer of this question? So, you get better attention. You become more curious to understand. So, automatically you kind of manipulate your mental functionings to get best out of what you read. So, second step is question. Then 3R, R1 is about read. Then once you develop questions, then you read it properly. Active reading to answer these questions. Whatever questions you created, try to answer them now from the content. Highlight key ideas, take brief notes, relate new information to what you already know. These steps helps in encoding information deeply into long-term memory. Now, read more actively to find those answers. Whatever works, taking notes, processing ideas, relating with the new information, whatever works, you read them properly, elaborately, actively. Then recite. R2 is recite. After reading a section, pause and recall the main points without looking at the text. Means, once you read a section, then without looking at that section, try to recall what you have learned. So, basically you are processing it more deeply. Summarize in your own words and say answer aloud. Usko fir try to answer those questions aloud without looking at it, because whatever you have processed now, try to summarize in your own words and answer it loud. So, this process strengthens retrieval pathways and enhance memory consolidation. So, basically these are ways to go deeper and deeper into the content, and so that you remember more. The last R3 is review, because now you have learned most of the things, now review it again. Finally, go over the material again, revisit notes and questions, review soon after learning and spaced interval and prevents forgetting. So, review, do the review, again kind of rehearse it and see how everything fits into the structure, and give more spaced, do not try to read everything at once, spaced reading is something very important. So, that will give you more memory consolidation. So, this is one broad techniques of studying which helps you to consolidate memory and learn better. Another techniques that a lot of this memory researcher talks about something is called as mnemonics. And the mnemonics are specifically works for remembering items and the list of the items. If you want to remember them, then probably it works in a better way. So these are also some memory techniques called mnemonics. These are memory aids or strategies that help people encode, store and recall information more easily by making it more meaningful, organized and vivid. These are all ways to process information more deeply so that you remember them. So in mnemonics, it's a Greek word, it comes from Greek word mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. Mnemonics work because they create strong associations through imageries, patterns, cues that make information much more easier or retrieve later. So I'll give some examples of mnemonics. So there are two main types of broad categories of mnemonics. One is acronyms. So using the first letter of word to create an easily rememberable word. For example, we talked about SQ3R technique. So this is an acronym. Otherwise, it is very difficult to remember survey, question, read, recite and so on. But if you just use an acronym, it is much more easier to remember now. SQ3R. Now I know everything: survey, question, read, recite and review. Now using an acronym, it is much more easier to remember longer list of items and so on. Okay. For example, big 5 factors in personality, we can use the acronym of OCEAN to remember them. So O is for openness, C is for conscientiousness, E is for extrovert, A is for agreeableness, N is for neuroticism. So people may find it difficult to remember these 5 names, but if you use the word OCEAN, each letter of this acronym will help you to remember. This will give you a cue to remember each of these words. So these are called acronyms. So many times creating an acronyms for a long list of items and so on helps you to remember much more easily. Then comes acrostics or sentence mnemonics. Okay. So that's called making a sentence where each words of first letter cues the information to remember. So making some sentences. For example, to remember the planets of the solar system, many people use some sentences like, my very educated mother just served us noodles. So you just, each first letter of each word in the sentence serve as one planet of the solar system. So M for Mercury, V for Venus, E for Earth, M for Mars, J for Jupiter, S for Saturn, U for Uranus, N for Neptune. So like this, So that you just create a sentence if possible, and with the first letter of each word of whatever list you want to remember. Sometimes it's very easy to remember. So these are called acrostics. Then some people use rhymes and songs to remember much more easily whenever something is possible, to convert them into rhymes and melodies. It is much more easier to remember in terms of songs and poems and so on. For example, how to remember which month has 30 days. So this is a rhymes. 30 days hath September, April, June and November. So you remember this months have 30 days, other months have 31 days. So some kind of rhyming and poetic sentences, songs can help you remember. Chunking, as we have already discussed, that chunking helps you to remember vast amount of information in much more easier ways. So what is chunking? Breaking large pieces of information into smaller meaningful groups. So for example, if you want to remember phone number, let's say this is the phone number, it is very difficult to remember it, but if you chunk it, let's say 331, 3 chunks, then it is much more easier to remember. Now you don't have to remember all the 9 numbers or whatever the number is there. Now you have to remember only 3 chunks. So the load is less. And we are able to process this information more actively in the short working memory so that it can be passed to the long term memory. People also use so many other mnemonics techniques to remember, like one is called method of loci. Is a mnemonic technique where you imagine placing items you want to remember in a specific familiar location, like room in your house. So you know what are the things kept in your room. So you connect each items of your room with one item that you want to remember in the list, in the visual imagination. Then just you go through that room and find out what are the list, automatically you will be remember. For example, let's say you want to remember the grocery list. Suppose you want to remember milk, apple, bread, soap and eggs. Imagine your house, main door, milk. So you just do a tour to your room and connect each item with the one item of your room. Main door, milk spilling everywhere, sofa, apples bouncing on it, TV, bread stuck on the screen, bathroom sink, soap overflowing, bed, egg crackling on the pillow. So you are connecting one of the items of your room which you know very clearly and connect it with one of the items. So you just give a mental tour of the room and you remember what are the items. So that is also another way of remembering lot of items. That is called method of loci. So you connect some location or some object with the items that you want to remember. Then there are something called as a peg word system, linking new information to pre-memorized list of pegs that rhyme with a number. For example, you can create a list of 1 to 10, like using 1 for a bun, some rhyming words, 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, something like that. So you can create a list of 10 items or something like that, and then you connect the first item with the bun. So 1 is for bun. So let's say you want to remember milk, eggs, apples. So imagine milk on the bun. So bun is for the first item is milk. Eggs in the shoe. Shoe means 2. So second item is egg. And apples hanging from the tree. Tree is 3. So apple is the third item. So like this. So you can connect those pre-memorized list of pegs and connect them with the list that you want to remember, because it helps you to visualize things and so deeperly, so it's much more easier to remember them. People can also create vivid mental pictures and stories to represent abstract information, to remember more. So visualization also helps you to remember a lot of this information. And we also already discussed distributed practice over time, So don't cramp everything at one place to remember everything. Spreading study with more intervals of time, distributed practice always, is better for memory. Psychologists consistently, emphasize cramming is an ineffective memory strategy, yet many people continue doing it, cramming everything at a one time, So just as musicians and athletes perform better by practicing regularly over time, learners also benefit from distributed practice, studying material in intervals rather than mass practice or cramming in the night before an exam. Everything they want to study at a time, just night before exam. So they will remember, a lot of interference will happen. So if you do distributed practice, on a, let's say on a week, on a month basis you have been studying, then interference will be less, there will be more memory consolidation, you are more likely to remember it better. So the research has clearly shown distributed practice produce superior learning and memory across all forms of learning. This even was found to be beneficial even in animal learning also. So this helps to enhance long-term retentions. Cramming everything in one particular space of time leads to shallow, short-lived memory gains and so on. So these are some of the things about memory. So this was this module ends here, memory module, where we talked about the different aspects of memory, and we introduced the different types of memories, what is memory, what are the different types, how we retrieve information from long-term memory, and today we discuss why we forget and why forgetting happens. We try to understand it, and also we try to give a lot of applications of this understanding in terms of how to improve memory. So with this I stop here. Thank you.